The screaming had been going on for 7 minutes, and it was bringing Cole Enterprises to a standstill. 8-year-old Eli Cole lay on the floor of the lobby, his small body rigid, his fists pounding the polished stone in a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than anger. His mother, Vivian Cole, the most powerful woman in the city, stood 3 feet away in $1,000 heels and a navy suit that had cost more than most of her employees made in a month. She was frozen. Her mouth moved, but whatever she was saying got swallowed by the next wave of screaming. "Eli," Vivian said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Eli, please. Tell Mommy what you need." The boy didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, and between sobs he lifted one hand and pointed upward, his finger trembling. Nobody followed his gaze. Nobody looked up. "He's having a severe meltdown of unknown origin. We may need to consider a sedative if we can't de-escalate in the next 10 minutes. Vivian's face went pale. "You're not sedating my son. I understand your concern, but his safety." I said no. Vivian Cole, who had negotiated hostile takeovers and stared down boards of directors and fired people without raising her voice, was losing control in her own lobby. She turned to the frozen employees, to the useless specialists, to the security guards standing near the door with their hands at their belts like they were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. $750,000, she said, and her voice carried across the marble like a bell. "I will pay $750,000 to anyone in this building who can help my son right now." The lobby went silent except for Eli's screaming. The number hung in the air. 750,000. People shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Nobody stepped forward. Marcus Williams had stopped his floor buffer 30 seconds ago. He was 52 years old, black, and had been invisible in this building for 8 years. He worked the morning shift, polishing the marble until it gleamed, emptying trash cans, fixing what needed fixing before the executives arrived. He knew which bathroom on the 3rd floor had a slow drain. He knew which elevator made a grinding sound on the way to the 14th floor. He knew the hum of the faulty fluorescent light near the 3rd pillar from the left, the one that flickered almost imperceptibly, just enough to bother someone with sensitive eyes. He stood near the east corridor, one hand still on the handle of his buffer, and watched the boy on the floor. His face didn't show pity. It showed recognition. His free hand moved to his chest pocket. Through the worn fabric of his uniform, he could feel the outline of a small blue matchbox car. It had been in that pocket for 12 years, ever since Noah was 3 years old and had pressed it into his father's hand one morning before therapy. "For brave," Noah had said. Noah, who had screamed like that. Noah, who had pointed at things nobody else saw. Noah, who had been gone for 4 years now, but whose matchbox car still went everywhere Marcus went. The specialists were trying their protocols again. Picture cards spread out on the marble like a losing hand at a poker table. Verbal prompts that sounded like they'd been memorized from a textbook. None of them were looking at what Eli was looking at. None of them had noticed the fluorescent light. Marcus could see it clear as day. The boy wasn't having a meltdown. The boy was trying to communicate. His screams weren't random, they were timed with the flicker. His pointing wasn't aimless, he was trying to show them what was hurting him. But nobody was paying attention. Nobody ever paid attention. Dr. Price was talking about sensory processing disorders and intervention thresholds, and Vivian was shaking her head, and the employees were pretending not to stare, and Eli was still screaming, and the light was still flickering, and Marcus released the handle of his buffer. The machine died to silence. He stepped forward. He'd taken 3 steps when a broad hand pressed against his chest. Curtis, the head of security, appeared in front of him like a wall. Curtis didn't move his hand. He was 6'4", 240 pounds, and he'd been head of security at Cole Enterprises for 11 years. He'd stopped reporters, protesters, process servers, and one time a guy who showed up with a machete and a grudge against the accounting department. He knew how to be a wall. But Marcus didn't push. He didn't raise his voice. He just met Curtis's eyes and said, quiet enough that only Curtis could hear, "I know what he's hearing." Something flickered in Curtis's expression. Not doubt exactly, more like the faintest crack in the concrete. Because Marcus had said hearing, not thinking or feeling. And the way he said it, the way his body stayed loose and his eyes stayed steady, it didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like a man reading from a script only he could see. Vivian Cole had heard him anyway. She turned from her son on the floor, and her face was a mess of streaked mascara and exhausted fury. The kind of fury that comes from being rich enough to buy anything except a solution. She looked at Marcus like she was trying to figure out what category of person he was, employee, threat, waste of time, and she couldn't place him, and that made her angrier. "Who is this?" she demanded. "Curtis, who is this man?" She gestured at Marcus's uniform, the gray maintenance shirt with the Cole Enterprises logo stitched on the chest, the worn knees of his work pants, the floor buffer standing silent behind him. "He's maintenance staff," Dr. Price said, "he has no credentials here. This child needs clinical intervention, not untrained interference. Vivian, you're paying me to manage this situation. Let me manage it." Vivian wavered. You could see it in her shoulders, the way they dropped half an inch toward protocol, toward trusting the expert she'd hired, toward the comfort of hierarchy. Dr. Price had degrees on her wall. Dr. Price had published papers. Dr. Price had a system, even if that system had been failing for 7 minutes and counting. Eli's screams had gone hoarse now, scraping out of his small throat like gravel. His body was trembling on the cold marble, his fists still pounding but weaker now, like his battery was running out. Marcus hadn't looked away from Vivian. He hadn't acknowledged Dr. Price at all. He raised his voice just enough to carry over Eli's screaming, just enough to be heard without shouting. "The light," he said. "Third panel from the left. It's been flickering for 2 weeks. I filed a repair request." He pointed upward. Everyone in the lobby, the frozen employees, the useless specialists, Curtis with his hands still half extended, Vivian with her ruined makeup, everyone finally looked up. The ceiling was a grid of recessed fluorescent panels, 40 feet above the marble floor, expensive and modern and supposed to be invisible. And there it was. Third panel from the left. The bulb was pulsing with a barely visible strobe, a rapid flicker just at the edge of perception. Not enough to notice if you were walking through. Not enough to bother anyone with normal sensory thresholds. But to a child with Eli's wiring, a child whose nervous system took everything at maximum volume, that flicker would feel like someone jabbing needles into his eyes with every pulse. Vivian's face shifted. It didn't happen all at once, it moved through stages. Confusion first, because she'd never noticed the light. Then disbelief, because how could it be that simple? Then a slow, creeping horror, because she'd spent $750,000 on specialists who'd never once looked at the ceiling. Dr. Price recovered fast. That was what $400 an hour bought you, speed. Eli has never responded to visual triggers before, she said, her voice still calm, still authoritative. His sensory profile is predominantly auditory. I've been working with him for 18 months. I know his patterns. Marcus turned his head toward her, finally, and his expression wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was pity. Maybe, he said quietly, because no one ever looked. He didn't wait for her response. He kept talking, his voice steady and certain, the voice of a man who'd learned things the hard way and never forgotten them. The way he's pounding his fists, that's not random. It's rhythmic. Marcus didn't walk toward the boy. He didn't crouch down or reach out or do any of the things the specialists had been trained to do in their graduate programs and their clinical rotations and their weekend workshops on de-escalation techniques. He just sat down, right there on the Italian marble, crossing his legs like he was settling in for a long conversation with an old friend. His gray janitor uniform looked ridiculous against the polished stone, the kind of contrast that would have made someone laugh if the lobby wasn't holding its breath. He didn't speak to Eli. Not a word. No soothing tones, no gentle reassurances, none of the scripted phrases Vivian had paid therapists to memorize. Instead, he lifted his right hand and began tapping his fingers on the floor. A steady 4-4 rhythm. The exact same pattern Eli had been pounding with his fists. The boy's eyes, still wet with tears, still squeezed half shut against the world, flickered. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, but there it was. The screaming didn't stop, but something shifted in the quality of it, like a radio signal finding its frequency. Marcus kept tapping. Soft. Predictable. Unchanging. Eli, he said, but the name came out different than when Vivian said it, different than when Dr. Price said it. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was just a sound, 3 beats, offered and then released. Eli didn't respond to his name. His fists kept pounding, but the rhythm was loosening, the edges blurring into something less desperate. Marcus's tapping never wavered. His face was calm, but not the practiced calm of a professional who'd been trained to mask their frustration. It was the calm of a man who'd been here before, who'd spent hours and days and years in this exact space, waiting for a child to find his way back. He whispered something under his breath, almost to himself, the kind of word you say when you're alone and the memory gets too heavy. Noah. The tapping continued. Marcus's other hand drifted to his pocket, not fast, not secretive, just the absent gesture of a man reaching for something familiar. He pulled out a small photograph, worn at the edges, the colors faded from too many years of being carried too close to the skin. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't hold it up or explain it. He just touched the edge of it with his thumb while his other hand kept the rhythm going, steady as a heartbeat. The photograph was of a boy. 14 years old, same age Eli was now. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, eyes that looked somewhere past the camera. Noah. Marcus's son. Nonverbal. Autistic. Killed in a car accident 6 years ago on a rainy Tuesday in October, the kind of ordinary day that had no business taking someone's child. Marcus had spent 12 years learning to listen to a boy who couldn't speak words. 12 years of decoding rhythms and patterns and the language of fists on floors. 12 years of being the only person in the room who understood that silence wasn't empty, that it was full of signals if you knew how to read them. The tapping kept going. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. Pause. Eli uncurled his fists. It happened slowly, finger by finger, like a flower opening in time-lapse. His small hands, red and raw from pounding marble, flattened against the floor. His breathing, which had been ragged and shallow for 40 minutes, began to sync with the rhythm of Marcus's fingers. The lobby was so quiet now that you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. The same lights Marcus had pointed to. The third panel from the left, still flickering, still strobing at a frequency that no one else in the building had ever noticed. Dr. Price stared. Her clipboard hung loose at her side, forgotten. The certainty that had been her entire professional identity was crumbling, and you could see it in the way her mouth opened slightly and then closed again, the way her eyes kept moving between Marcus and Eli like she was watching an equation she'd been told was unsolvable suddenly resolve itself. Eli's eyes opened fully. For the first time in 40 minutes, he wasn't looking through people or past them. He was looking at someone. At Marcus. Marcus shifted the rhythm. He added a pause where there hadn't been one before, then a double tap, quick and light. Vivian Cole didn't sit down so much as her body gave up the fight to stay upright. Her knees hit the marble with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by the silence that had swallowed everything else in that lobby. "What happened?" she asked, and her voice was nothing like the voice that had offered Marcus $750,000 40 minutes ago. That voice had been polished marble. This one was cracked concrete. Marcus's face, which had been a wall since the moment he sat down on this floor, finally broke. Not all at once. It started at the corners of his mouth, a tremor he couldn't control, and then it spread to his jaw, his temples, the skin around his eyes. "Noah was 2, he said. 2 years old when we got the diagnosis. My wife, Dana, she cried for 3 days straight. I didn't cry at all. I thought crying was for people who'd given up, and I wasn't going to give up on my boy. Took me 5 years to realize I wasn't being strong. I was just being stupid. Crying wasn't giving up. It was admitting I was terrified, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I needed help. This car," Marcus said, and his voice went rough, the way a voice goes when it's carrying too much weight, was Noah's favorite thing in the world. He carried it everywhere. Slept with it. Bathed with it. When the world got too loud, and for Noah, the world was always too loud, he'd hold this car and run the wheels back and forth across his palm. Back and forth. Back and forth. 4 hours sometimes. Eli's fingers wrapped around the car. Not tight. Just present. His breathing had synced completely with the rhythm Marcus had tapped out on the marble, a rhythm that had no name but meant something specific. "I'm here. I'm listening. You're not alone." Marcus looked up at Vivian, and there was no accusation in his eyes. That was the thing that broke her. If he'd been angry, she could have defended herself. If he'd been cruel, she could have fought back. But he was just tired, and sad, and carrying 12 years of grief that had nowhere else to go. "Eli wasn't having a random meltdown," he said. "He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't trying to embarrass you or ruin your meeting or whatever you thought was happening. He was trying to tell everyone about the light." Marcus pointed up at the ceiling, at the third panel from the left, still flickering, still strobing at a frequency that no one else had bothered to notice. For 40 minutes, he pointed at that light. He covered his ears. He screamed toward the ceiling. And not one person looked up. Not the specialists you brought in. Not the security team. Not even you. Vivian's hand went to her mouth. Her knuckles pressed against her lips, hard, the way you press on a wound to stop the bleeding. "The tragedy isn't your son's condition," Marcus said, and his voice was softer now, almost gentle. "The tragedy is that the whole world decided he wasn't worth listening to. Everyone in this building looked at a child in pain and saw a problem to be managed instead of a person trying to communicate. You wanted to fix him. You never once thought to join him." Vivian broke. Not gracefully. Not quietly. The sound that came out of her was raw and ugly and real, the kind of crying that doesn't care who's watching. She reached for Eli, then stopped herself, her hands hovering in the air like she'd forgotten how to touch her own child. "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it to Eli first, then to Marcus, then to the universe, as if she were apologizing to every person she'd ever failed to see. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have known. I'm his mother. I should have." "Stop," Marcus said. Not harsh. Just firm. Guilt won't help him. Shame won't help him. What helps him is what helps every child like Noah, like Eli. You learn their language. You stop trying to drag them into your world and you start visiting theirs. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. Noah's face stared back at him, frozen at 14, eyes looking somewhere past the camera, past the years, past the accident on that rainy Tuesday in October. "I spent 12 years failing," Marcus said. 12 years getting it wrong, trying again, getting it wrong differently, trying again. And somewhere in all that failing, I learned something. Marcus rose slowly, his knees cracking from the cold marble, the sound sharp in the silence. He reached down and helped Vivian to her feet with a gentleness that surprised her, not the careful gentleness of someone handling fragile cargo, but the steady gentleness of someone who'd carried weight before and knew exactly how heavy it could get. "Keep the money," Marcus said. The words landed like a grenade with the pin still in. "I don't want the reward," Marcus continued, and he looked at Eli as he said it, at the boy who was now rolling the blue car back and forth across the marble, humming softly, completely unaware that he'd just shattered his mother's entire worldview. "But I want you to use it. Every dollar. I want you to take that $750,000 and create something that should have existed 12 years ago, when I was sitting in a hospital room with a 14-year-old who wouldn't look at me and a stack of pamphlets that might as well have been written in a foreign language." "What are you proposing?" "The Noah Williams Center," Marcus said, and it was the first time he'd ever spoken those words out loud, the first time the name had left his mouth and entered the world. He said it the way you say something sacred, not loud, not dramatic, but with the weight of 12 years behind every syllable. A place where parents with lived experience can support families newly navigating diagnoses like Eli's. Not specialists who've read about autism in textbooks. Not clinicians who've studied it from the outside. Parents who've been in the trenches. Parents who know what it feels like to love a child the world keeps trying to fix instead of understand. Vivian stared at him, and her business mind was already calculating location, staffing, operational costs, the logistics of turning a janitor's vision into brick and mortar. But her heart, which had been locked in a boardroom for so long she'd forgotten it existed, saw something else entirely. She saw the 12 years Marcus had spent failing and failing differently and learning again. She saw the photograph of Noah in his pocket, the blue car in her son's hands, the invisible thread connecting a dead 14-year-old to an 8-year-old who'd just been heard for the first time in his life. "Why did you stay?" she asked, and her voice cracked on the question. "After Noah died. Why did you stay at Coal Enterprises? You could have gone anywhere. You could have." She stopped, because she didn't know what he could have done. She'd never bothered to find out what her janitors were capable of. Marcus folded the paper back up and tucked it into his pocket. "I needed to be somewhere I could help," he said simply. "Even if no one saw me. Even if no one knew my name. You've got 4,000 people in this building, and every single one of them is fighting something. You just have to pay attention." He gestured at the lobby, at the marble floors he'd polished for 8 years, at the elevators he knew by sound, at the bathrooms with the slow drains and the fluorescent lights with the flicker nobody else noticed. The invisible man sees everything. That's the whole point of being invisible. Vivian looked at the check in Claire's hand. $750,000. She could write it, thank Marcus, and move on. She could give him a promotion, a plaque, a handshake, and go back to her corner office and pretend this afternoon had never happened. She'd done harder things. She'd buried a husband. She'd built an empire. She'd spent 8 years not knowing her own son was trying to tell her about a flickering light. "The center," she said, and her voice was steady now, the CEO voice returning but different somehow, softer at the edges, like steel that had been heated and reshaped. "I'll fund it. But I'm not putting my name on it. It's the Noah Williams Center, and it stays the Noah Williams Center." She paused, and then she said the thing that surprised everyone in that lobby, including herself, "And I want you to lead it." Marcus's hand, still resting on Eli's shoulder, went still. "I'm a janitor, Ms. Cole. Not a director. Not a specialist. I don't have credentials." The Noah Williams Center opened on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, and the first thing anyone noticed was the light. Not the harsh fluorescence that hummed in hospital hallways and clinic waiting rooms, not the cold white panels that made every parent feel like they were sitting inside a diagnosis. Marcus had spent 3 months arguing with contractors about this. The building itself was modest, a converted retail space on a quiet street, but the families who came were looking. They'd been looking their whole lives. Marcus stood at the door in a simple button-down shirt, no uniform, no name tag, greeting each person as they walked through. He shook hands with fathers who hadn't slept in 3 years. He knelt to meet children at eye level. 6 weeks after the doors opened, Vivian Cole walked in holding Eli's hand. She wasn't the CEO of Cole Enterprises that morning. She was just a mother with a crumpled diagnosis in her bag and 8 years of not knowing her own son weighing on her shoulders. Eli stepped into the center and stopped. He walked toward Marcus, his mother's hand slipping from his grasp, and when he reached the man who had once been invisible, he tapped a 4/4 rhythm on Marcus's palm. A greeting. A recognition. A conversation. Vivian wept. These were the tears of a mother watching her son say hello for the first time. The center's philosophy was simple, and it was radical. Parents led the support groups, not clinicians. Not specialists with degrees and certificates and no lived experience. Parents who'd been in the trenches. Grandparents who'd learned to adapt holidays, who taught other grandparents how to make Christmas morning work when the lights were too bright and the noise was too much and the traditions that had worked for generations suddenly didn't work anymore. Siblings learned to communicate through rhythm and presence, through the quiet understanding that love didn't always need words. Marcus ran the daily operations, scheduling, funding, the endless logistics of keeping a nonprofit alive, but his real role was something else. He was the living proof. The man who'd buried a son and kept going. The man who'd spent 12 years failing and failing differently and learning again. He was the evidence that survival was possible, that joy existed on the other side of diagnosis, that you could lose everything and still find a reason to tap a rhythm on the floor. Curtis, the security guard who tried to physically remove Marcus from the Cole Enterprises lobby, volunteered every Saturday. He'd shown up on the second weekend, 6'4" and 240 pounds of awkward apology, and Marcus had handed him a paintbrush without a word. They'd painted the sensory room together. Curtis had admitted, somewhere between the second coat and the third, that he'd been wrong that day. That he'd looked at a janitor and seen a threat instead of a father. That he'd been so sure he knew what danger looked like that he'd almost missed what safety looked like. Marcus had nodded, and they'd kept painting, and that had been enough. Dr. Sandra Price attended a workshop in the 3rd month. She sat in the back row, the renowned specialist who'd diagnosed hundreds of children, who'd written papers and given keynotes and trained clinicians across the country. She didn't speak. She didn't introduce herself. She just took notes, not as an expert, but as a student. Afterward, she asked Marcus if she could come back. Not to teach. To learn. Every morning, before the center opened, Marcus sat alone in the quiet room. The one with the softest light and the thickest carpet and the chair that didn't make noise when you shifted your weight. He held the blue Matchbox car, its paint worn thin from years of small hands and smaller rituals, and he told Noah about the families they were helping. About the mother who'd called last week, her voice shaking, because her son had spoken his first word at age 6 in their sensory room. About the father who'd broken down in the hallway, admitting he'd almost left his family because he didn't know how to be a father to a child he didn't understand. About Eli, who now hummed entire conversations with Marcus, who was learning that his voice mattered even if it didn't sound like anyone else's.